Hello dear viewers, I'm George from Ireland and here I am at the Royal Palace in Kew. This is in Kew Gardens, which is the United Kingdom's national botanic gardens. So this house was constructed in 1631 for a Mr. Fortray, who was a very affluent London silk merchant, silk being much more expensive back then than it is today, for silk stockings, silk dresses, and even men would wear silk waistcoats quite a lot with their morning dress. Anyway, for ball gowns, any self-respecting upper-class person had to wear silk, but obviously very, very few people could afford it. So he built this, and this was well into the countryside in the county of Surrey. We're south of the River Thames. This was considered outside London back then. Obviously, it's well within the boundaries of Greater London these days. Anyway, so when it was purchased by George II and his queen, and it was mainly for three of their daughters to reside here. The house is known as Little Kew. People colloquially called it the Dutch house. It's meant to be a Dutch style, partly why it's red, and you'll see the gardens are a bit like that as well. So it only became a botanic garden, the whole Kew area, much later in the early 18th century. And when George II was here, that's when he was a great fan of Alexander Pope, who lived not so far away at Twickenham, just over the river. And that's when Pope composed some doggerel for the King's hound, and on the King's dog's collar it said, "I am His Majesty's dog at Kew, pray sir, whose dog are you?" So Twickenham has a distinguished poetic heritage. Walter de la Mare having lived there, though he's principally known as a novelist. Alfred Lord Tennyson. Was there anyone else? Well, Jonathan Swift used to visit Alexander Pope there, and with their death that signalled the end of the Augustan age in poesy. So here is round the rear of this building, and the garden here is laid out in a Dutch style with all these geometric shapes. It's based on a garden at Verneuil in France, and this is box hedge, I think, the outer hedge to keep it in. A bit of lavender in the middle. I mean, lavender grows naturally around in London. There's Lavender Hill in Lambeth, not so far away, and it really was mostly lavender growing there. It was wilderness until the mid-19th century. It's surprisingly late how some of London was built up. Surprisingly late how late some of it was built up. My goodness, I'm misspeaking all the time. I don't know who these busts represent. Look at this female figure in neoclassical style. Does she have flowers in her locks, perhaps? And this chap has seen better days. Because sometimes they would represent historical figures, and they were coming on to someone who's a Diabolonian in appearance, but missing a horn. And on we go. George II dwelt here, then George III came here, was owned by George IV, who'd been the Prince Regent. I'm not sure when it left the royal hands, but it's still meant to be a royal garden. So it's the smallest of the royal palaces, and I've been to all the others, apart from, say, Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland, which is the House of Windsor's official residence in Northern Ireland, right beside Stormont, which is where the Northern Ireland Assembly is based. And who is this little figure here? Looks like a little Hermes, and he's carrying a fish which he's got out of the pond. Anyway, so George III, he was taken mentally ill in 1788 with porphyria. This is what it's assumed to be by medical historians reading about his symptoms. It was possibly another condition he got from some of the chemicals in the wigs, and it was taken here because he was exhibiting pressured speech, and he was rabbiting on non-stop, wittering on for 24 hours at a go, such as absolutely bounding with energy and scarcely making sense with this logorrhea. So they had to take him here, and they tried all sorts of things. They tried restraining him, hot and cold treatments, blistering his skin, drawing the bad humours down from his brain towards his legs, sensory deprivation in terms of light and sound. Then one of his equerries had a deranged mother-in-law, and her derangement of mind had improved when she'd been under the care of a certain Dr. Willis, an Anglican clergyman, who also moonlighted as a physician and had a farm in Lincolnshire where he had some of his patients do farm work, and you need to be a little bit active to get better. I mean, George III was always very physically active, exceptionally exuberant and energetic, perhaps too much, manic. And you may have seen The Madness of King George, where that Dr. Willis is very admirably portrayed by the late Ian Holm. Is it Holm or Home, who just died last year, himself the son of a physician. So, and George III was not exempted from the physical toil that his patients had to undergo. But anyway, Dr. Willis cared for him for some time here at Kew. And they used to wear quite plain clothes, and he wasn't wearing a wig. And some will say, well, that's what actually meant they made the mental disorder go away, because he no longer was coming into contact with those noxious chemicals. That's one theory. I mean, nobody can properly diagnose them because they haven't met the patient. Yeah, that was 1788, but he gradually recovered his senses, and as sanity was restored, he could be restored to the throne because his son, whom he loathed, his eldest was the future George IV, was Prince Regent, so there was no love lost between father and firstborn. So his eldest son, George IV, had to discharge kingly functions on behalf of his father, who was temporarily incapacitated. But when George III was compos mentis again, he was restored to full sovereign powers. You might think, oh, is it the American Revolution happened because he was mentally ill? No, this is sometime after the French Revolution. Even the Peace of Paris was sort of not French Revolution, American Revolution. The Peace of Paris was 1783, so that was the United Kingdom recognizing American independence. So that was long over. 1788 is when his mental disorder manifested itself. Anyway, so it's not really a cause and effect thing. It might have been hereditary. So he was otherwise ebullient, and he was a very physically fit man. He and his wife, Queen Charlotte, they enjoyed an exceptionally happy marriage. So happy, in fact, that they were blessed with 17 children, 9 sons and 7 daughters. And I think all of them lived to adulthood, which even for royalty was exceptional back then because infant mortality was so dreadfully high. But he wouldn't let his daughters marry till they were well into adulthood, well into their 20s, which was exceptional. Usually princesses would marry in their mid-teens. So his wife, she was of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. So I don't think they actually spoke German because and George III, he was born in the United Kingdom in 1739, but he never left southeast England. So his father was Frederick the Prince of Wales. But Frederick the Prince of Wales predeceased his own father, George II, which is why the crown went straight from grandfather George II to grandson George III. Whereas George I and George II had been born in Hanover. They were also electors of Hanover. The dynasty subsequently elevated to be king of Hanover. Elector insofar as they cast an electoral vote to choose the Holy Roman Emperor of the German nation. But the Holy Roman Empire, as Jean-Marie Arouet said, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and not really that German. About half of it was German. Some Germanic states were not part of the Holy Roman Empire, and on and on. So hope you got an idea of the dimensions of this place. You can't see it, but the River Thames is just beyond that wall. Those trees are on the marge of the Thames. So there's always been a riverside pleasance. They wouldn't have had those ghastly tower blocks there at Brentford as they are now. Because Brentford is so called because the River Brent flows out there. It's a tributary of the Thames, and it lends its name to a Brentford football club, which has just got itself a new ground. The only football stadium in the British Isles with a pub on each corner. So the new football stadium for Brentford FC also has a pub on each corner. There's a London Borough of Brent a bit further north. And obviously the river lends its name to that borough, but that was an amalgamation of 3 different boroughs. They're put together to create Brent in 1965, when the boroughs of London were reorganised, was slimmed down from 86 to a more manageable 32. But back to George III. So he had an ingemination of his mental illness in 1801, subsequently in 1804, lastly in 1811, which lasted to the end of his life. So he was raving mad. He'd completely lost his eyesight by the end, and he was just not seen as public. His son had to execute all his kingly functions. He fell out with his son over a number of issues. George III was uniquely faithful to his good wife. George IV, he had a romantic liaison with Mrs. Fitzherbert, this twice widowed Catholic woman, and who'd had no children from either of her husbands. She had no children with him. And some people say, did they actually secretly get married? But because of the Royal Marriages Act, no member of the royal house could marry without the king's say-so. George III had this past because his brother had married without the king's knowledge, and George III was aghast because it was sort of a morganatic marriage, though his brother's children weren't actually excluded from the line of succession, but he'd married someone who was rather infra dignitate, so George III thought. Anyway, what else about George IV? But he certainly had her as a mistress, and he was very profligate. He built various things, that pavilion down at Brighton. He was fascinated by all things Indian, though he never went abroad. He didn't wear a wig, which was something new. Everybody else wearing a peruke until his time, and then he set the fashion. Wigs were out, which they'd been in for easily 150 years. And then he built Carlton House in London, so was spending with gay abandon and ally the Whigs. Not that he particularly believed in their ideology, but they were willing to give him what he wanted, whereas George III was a dyed-in-the-wool Tory. So the royalty could be very partisan. This idea of royal neutrality politics is a fairly recent innovation, dating back to perhaps the late 19th century. Anything else about George III and so on? So he died in 1820, and he's interred at Windsor Castle like the rest of them. His Queen Charlotte, she was on her way from London to Windsor when she fell ill, and the journey was interrupted. She's brought here for repose and medical treatment, and then she died here a few weeks later in this house in 1818. So then her carcass was transported to Windsor, and they laid straw there in the courtyard at Windsor, so her husband wouldn't hear the carriage arriving. They didn't want him to know there was a funeral, that his wife was dead. I mean, would he not like to participate in the exequies? I don't think it could have disturbed him any more than he was already mentally disturbed. Anyway, so that's just a little bit about this Royal Palace here at Kew, which under ordinary circumstances is open to the public, but coronavirus being what it is because of this exigent situation, we're not permitted to enter. It does have a lot of original furniture. Okay, so that's enough from me at Kew Gardens. So please follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and book online lessons with me in history, politics, religious studies, English language, English literature, citizenship, French, law, and choose me as your tour guide in Londinium. I also translate from French, Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, Romanian, and that's about it. Okay, toodaloo.